Any opposed? No. Thank you. Right, we'll move on to item 9. We have... So I had Rebecca on there, but it's just Katarainu. Cool, thank you. Katarainu Maki will introduce item 9 and all the significant amount of work that's been going on since February. So thanks, Kat.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi kia koutou. I'll just quickly introduce this report, which the purpose is to endorse an approach to accelerating a resilient Tāmaki Makaurau Auckland, which is attached to the agenda report. This mahi comes from a February committee resolution, a March approval for a scope. We have delivered 8 responsive briefings to elected members as agreed. And we have brought this early insight report back due to the pace of recovery efforts, particularly making space for water, and a request by governing body to make sure all of the mahi around this area is aligned. The report before you just goes through a simple narrative of what happened, what did we learn, what can we do. I think we distilled things down to 3 clear improvement areas. Auckland Council has a lot of strategic direction around resilience, adaptation, water-sensitive design. Your strategic settings are firm and solid for the future. However, our delivery pathways and embedding action around those areas does need to happen faster. We can improve particularly water-sensitive design in our networks and the networks of others. And this is about really embedding it as business as usual. We can improve our support of mana whenua and Māori to undertake adaptation and resilience planning, as well as supporting our communities to do the same. So what can we do? We're proposing 3 things to work together. Strengthen the unitary plan, which is the subject of a paper today, and you will consider the details of that during that paper. Speed up community adaptation action, which is a funded program, and making space for water, which you have had several presentations on, and a committee paper will come to you in July, setting out a wider package and looking for public consultation. We also had requests through a governing body meeting to make sure that all of Auckland Council whānau are aligned. So it's aligned action that approves outcomes, that we also not just keep our eye on short-term action now, but we keep thinking about medium and long-term. So we've also included a way to make sure you can see and manage that. One of the things about that is to make sure that while we're coherent and aligned, we also make the best use of scarce resources. We think about the costs to deliver benefits and what the trade-offs are and whether the trade-offs are worth it. And because the programs can be very resource intense, not for just Auckland Council, but for our communities, we need to think about unintended consequences and costs. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kat. Thank you very much. A huge amount of work by many people. I have no questions, which is surprising to me. Councillor Turner. Yes, so first I'd just like to move this, and Councillor Dalton would like to second. Are there any questions at all? Councillor Walker.
Yeah. A question I've put before is, it mentions, water sensitive design and the like. Can we join the Water Sensitive Cities Network? Can we actually make a decision to do that? That involves collaboration with the universities, so we can actually fast track our approaches. So when are we going to do that?
We can bring back a paper for you to consider that.
That would be marvellous. The costs are fairly incidental. I'd suggest they mesh with what we're doing. It would enable the engagement of a number of universities and a collaborative approach whereby we would benefit from a great deal of experience from other cities.
Kia ora, Councillor. We have used some of the information through the water sensitive cities, through the water strategy. Part of the issue is the difference with our partnership with Mana Whenua and the differences that were in that, but we have been using a lot of the work through that. So, but it is worth revisiting this term if we want to discuss that. So, kia ora, Councillor. Councillor Ferry. Right, no other questions? Right, thank you. So I'll just briefly get Councillor Turner to speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's kind of a little bit related to this, but also related to Mr. Craig McElroy's delivery the other day, and there wasn't a space to say anything. When we talked about this making space for water, about lineal parks that we can use to retain the water, and then we strayed into talking about all the other things they could do, which was playgrounds and swings and you know, all that sort of stuff. And I just sat there thinking to myself, we don't want to lose focus of the primary reason why we're building these. They can be utilised for other things, but often kids get more fun with a cardboard box in there. And so I just don't, I sat there thinking, boy, I can see the costs loading onto this real fast, and all of a sudden we get one making space for water, not 5. So it was just my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Turner. Any other comments? Right, just briefly say, before we head to item 10, just acknowledge the huge amount of work Councillor Dalton and I, with the support of the Mayor and Deputy Mayor, pushed through some creative questions and comments with all of this committee in February and March, and you've all turned up, significantly changed what you were doing, and have given us a lot to think about. There's a lot of options and changes coming forward. Some of that has influenced the Mayor's flood response through the annual plan. We have a significant amount of work that will come in item 10 around plan changes and changes to the unitary plan. There are work in the regulating overland flow paths, addressing stormwater maintenance. There is going to be potentially regulatory changes that aren't going to be popular with everyone, but we have to do that. Those conversations will be hard and they will be different, and people who aren't maybe affected this time will only thank us if they're affected in another time, but they might not thank us now. But I think it's important to keep sight of that. People lost their lives through these extreme weather events in January and February. You know, over 7,000 individual homes and properties were affected. 8,500 cars were towed off our network. Over 7,000 trees. We've looked at our parks today. 32 of our rivers had record levels that never ever seen before. The ground is so saturated, and I think it was about 2 weeks ago we've now crossed the line of rain, our normal rain average for a year. So we're well over 1.1 metres of water this year, which is our average for 1 year, and we're only halfway through the year. So we do need to change what we're doing. We need change right across everything council does, and this will help enable that. Those conversations are going to be difficult, but if we continue to pretend the climate isn't changing and we don't have to deal with these things, we will continue to make mistakes of the past. So I think it's up to all of us through this process and the 10-year budget to fund and do what many of our staff and the evidence has been telling us for some time. So all those in favour? I don't think I was signalled that. I did ask twice, but you have a very brief comment, Councillor Walker, or have we already voted?
I'll make it incredibly brief. I just referenced the earlier discussion today about what the government and Kāinga Ora are foisting on us, which is in absolute contradiction of this process. So I just bring to the attention of councillors the importance of a joined-up approach and constantly reinforcing to the government that Auckland needs to be in charge of what's good for Auckland, because we know, not them. And we need to reinforce that at every occasion possible, because they're messing us up.
Absolutely, Councillor Walker, but it does need to be a partnership, because as we know with our Category 3s and our Making Space for Water, we are trying to rely on the government for significant funding to do that. So partnership is important. We need to lead together. Thank you. Now, I think we said all those in favour, and everyone almost said aye. Aye. Anyone opposed? Perfect. We'll move on to item 10. We have, I think, Phil, Reid, just Phil? And Tian. Thank you both. Right, so as we've heard in the previous item, there were 3 areas. One of the lines of action through the Resilient Tamaki Makaurau is to strengthen the unitary plan. We've had a good workshop discussion on this. There was a lot of positive comments around the breadth and the detail that has been worked on and what needs to go forward. So now we will be looking at an item to progress this work. This is not passing a plan change, but the staff will go through that now. Thank you, Phil.
Kia ora koutou, Phil Reid, Auckland-wide Planning Manager, and joined by Tian Lee, Senior Planner within Plans and Places. So, as mentioned in the previous item, this is sitting within that broader Resilient Tamaki Makaurau Auckland Work Programme, focusing on the strengthening of the unitary plan. And just to set the context, probably firstly that broader context for this issue. This is obviously a very long-term issue for Auckland, related to Auckland's resilience and the safety of all Aucklanders. To get to this point, Auckland is reflective of many different planning systems and development that's occurred under those to get to this point. The unitary plan obviously is focused on new development as it's occurring, so it's the extent to which we can tilt the waka towards a more resilient longer-term future. So within the Resource Management Act itself, natural hazard management has always been an issue for us. As a unitary authority, it sits as both a regional and a district function for us. The government saw that within 2017 it was important to actually take the component within that which was a significant risk and elevate that component to become a matter of national importance, and so that sits within that section 6H. And that matter of significant risk is probably the first underpinning reason today that I believe that we're in a position to be able to recommend that we proceed with the investigation of a plan change. Just to run through some of what we do within the unitary plan already, just a reminder that natural hazards are a very broad issue as a planning issue, but not all components of natural hazards are what we have within scope for the unitary plan. So where we do face risks that are the risks from our volcanic field, risks from earthquake, risk from tsunamis, we're not looking at those matters today. We are focused on these ones of erosion, inundation, flooding, instability and wildfires. The existing regime that we've got within the unitary plan differentiates the management of risk from our greenfield areas compared to our urban areas. So within our greenfield areas, the opportunity to manage development is enhanced, so therefore we're setting a void outcome. With respect to brownfield areas, we recognise that there can be give and take, provided that that overall risk exposure is not one that increases. Most of the consenting occurs on a site-by-site basis to consider natural hazards, and most of those resource consents do occur as what's called a restricted discretionary activity, where the matters that can be considered are restricted. There are opportunities for them to be declined, but those opportunities to decline are by their very nature restricted as well. Staying with the unitary plan, section 35 of the RMA does require that we actually sit back and look at its performance. So the 2016 through 2021 period, so the first 5 years of the life of the unitary plan, has been the subject of a number of reports which are being published, and we're looking towards publishing our report on natural hazards and climate change, hopefully by next Friday. So looking on screen, a couple of examples of data that we use to be able to do this type of analysis of the performance of the unitary plan. So on the left, we've got the location of all the consents that have been issued within Auckland during that 5-year period that related to development, which was within floodplains. And on the right-hand side, all of those consents that were issued with respect to overland flow paths. So what we do is we actually look at creating representative sample sets, analysing those consents, understanding the way in which those consents were processed, identifying the improvements that can come, whether it be to the consenting processes or the provisions upon which they were based, and also considering the broader environment as well and how it changes through time. So the second main underpinning basis that we believe that we can come to you and seek endorsement to proceed with a plan change is that the Section 35 report has recommended a number of changes that be investigated for improvement to the unitary plan. And the analysis that we've been doing of the data which is coming through from the severe weather events that we have faced earlier this year is proving to corroborate many of those findings. So that analysis will continue, but we believe that we're at that point of being able to recommend that we proceed to investigate a plan change. Of course, there was work which was already going on relative to natural hazards, in particular in relation to coastal hazards. The work which had been undertaken by Resilient Land and Coast to be able to better identify the 20, 50 and 100-year risk profile areas of coastal erosion had made ground relative to land information memorandums, and we were able to incorporate some of that information for what we went out with as part of Plan Change 78, and we signalled within Plan Change 78 that we would be looking to actually make further changes to the unitary plan on this issue. So that issue remains very much alive. There are opportunities to move from a text definition-based approach of coastal erosion to a more accurate mapping-based approach of coastal erosion. And we also have the opportunity to better align our understanding of coastal inundation, given the work which has been led nationally to identify the 100-year sea level rise level, as well as the vertical land movement aspect of that as well. Added to the mix, and this is why I've shown it on screen, is the opportunity to be able to consider options about zoning. So we have a variety of zones which have been applied within the coastal risk area, and that zoning does provide for quite a wide spectrum of development intensity. So this will be one of the issues that we look to analyse further within this plan change. Within the Section 35 work and the analysis of the further data that's coming through, it's really important to be able to actually understand the extent to which the information that's presented relates to the performance of the unitary plan itself. So we're looking specifically at those consents that have been issued during the life of the unitary plan and understanding what within those consents performed well and what perhaps are opportunities to improve. Of course, being able to address an issue like natural hazards is not one which can be done through regulation alone. So a non-regulatory approach needs to synchronise with what approaches may be taken to strengthen the unitary plan. And those opportunities for non-regulatory intervention can be quite wide. So whether they are awareness raising, whether they are incentives, whether they are forward work programs of asset management, whether they are levels of service, whether they are our bylaws, whether they are our guidance documentations. There are a number of things that actually influence outcomes that relate to natural hazard management. The unitary plan is a key part of that mix, but it is not by any means the only lever which can be used. So within the unitary plan, there are a number of options that could be taken with respect to natural hazard management across a spectrum of greater regulation through to lesser regulation. Currently, we sit within a situation which is that yellow ringed box where we take predominantly what's called Auckland-wide approach, which is a chapter within the unitary plan which applies across all of the zones. And this particular chapter, which is the Natural Hazards and Flooding chapter, E36, looks at applying activity statuses for resource consent against different risks, against different locations, for different activities. So whether it's subdivision, whether it's use, whether it's development. If we were looking to actually take a stronger approach, we've got some options which would take us to the left of that yellow box. The first option could be just to actually strengthen that particular chapter, which would be a continuation of the site-by-site assessment approach for individual developments. The area which I believe we need to investigate further is the orange ringed box, which is where we look at marrying zoning in a better way to the level of risk that we face in those locations. So this is not something which is a broad-ranging situation. It does need to be done in an identified way, and we do need to consider that degree of natural hazard risk which is faced by those locations. So I bring you back to that section 6H matter which I raised earlier about significant risk. That, I believe, will be a key guiding principle for where we need to be very serious about the utilisation of zoning in conjunction with the strengthened E36 for the management of natural hazards. Of course, we could go even further. There are powers which sit under the Resource Management Act to be able to apply prohibited activity status, which is to remove the right of individuals to even apply for a resource consent to be able to do development. And that can apply in a way which relates to new development. It can also apply in a way which relates to existing use rights and ongoing occupation. I'm not looking to recommend the broad-scale use of that type of technique. It perhaps might be appropriate in targeted situations. There are some instances across the unitary plan, such as for moorings in Akahu Bay or mustarlid farming within rural areas. Some examples of subdivision within the Waitakere Ranges that do fit within that category, but you need to have a very strong policy basis to it, and you need to be able to cross a burden of proof to show that you would not be able to do developments in those locations which would be able to address that risk. But going further into what I believe are some opportunities for us to look at more closely with you through workshops to come. Firstly, with respect to E36, it's got an activity table within it which goes through and, as I said, applies predominantly the restricted discretionary activity status. Given that we now understand risk, for examples such as coastal erosion in a more granular way, and given that we understand, for instance, flooding risks, that there are other risks beyond what we manage within the unitary plan, which at the moment, I remind you, is simply floodplains and for the modification of overland flow paths, that there are other flooding risks that we believe could appropriately be managed as well. Gives us the opportunity to be able to look at what would be the appropriate activity statuses to apply to those across those different activities of subdivision, use or development. Of course, if we're looking to actually amend the resource consents and the triggers for resource consents, we need to actually look closely at all of the associated provisions that go with those. So the objectives and policy framework would need to match, as well as the assessment criteria and the information requirements that we've got. Downzoning, as I mentioned, I believe is an appropriate tool to be used in identified locations of where we face the most significant risks. It is also important to understand that where downzoning is reached for as a tool to be married with a strengthening of E36, that we consider the implications on that particular location. And there might be some locations, particularly those locations that are very well connected locations, where the removal of opportunities within those locations needs to be addressed through enhancing opportunities in other areas in that same place. Through the Section 35 work and through the workshops, it will of course be important to keep you abreast of the improvements that can be made to planning practice within the current regime that we've got at the moment. So there have been a number of staff training exercises that have been run with our regulatory department There are practice notes which are being improved as well. And we need to be able to look at whether or not all of the tools that are available are actually being used to the full extent. So there could well be some further opportunities that are available within the way in which we condition the approvals that are given, and within the way in which we actually check on the compliance with those conditions through time as well. So should an endorsement be given to proceed with this investigation of changes to the unitary plan, we envisage that the details will need to be worked through. It is likely that there'll be a need to do probably 3 to 4 workshops on this to be able to traverse the range of issues, the locations which are affected, and the right mix of tools to be used. But in considering these options for improvement to the unitary plan, we can now consider the process issues associated with being able to notify a plan change to the unitary plan. So through the Housing Supply Amendments to the Resource Management Act in 2021 and recent Environment Court decisions which have been given, which is on screen for you there, it's become clear that Section 80E of the Resource Management Act mitigates against us being able to put in place zoning or controls that are more restrictive than those that were in place prior to the notification of Plan Change 78. This section applies both to current submissions that we've got on Plan Change 78 and the viability of any variation that we might wish to do to Plan Change 78. Additionally, we cannot advance a plan change to zoning and E36, whilst these very same provisions remain the subject of Plan Change 78. And finally, we are unable to withdraw either in entirety or even in part Plan Change 78. So we must allow Plan Change 78 to proceed to its completion before we can notify a natural hazards plan change to the unitary plan. This slide shows the spectrum of public participation approaches. Recommendation D recognises that the community and mana whenua and mātāwaka engagement needs need to be reflective of the scale and significance of the contemplated changes to the unitary plan, as well as being reflective of the other engagement that's ongoing through Making Space for Water and the government's 3-level categorisation initiative. Under the law as it stands, the green arrow leading to a plan change to the unitary plan is the viable pathway forward. Other pathways could become viable, but would be dependent upon legislative change. Should sections like Section 80E of the RMA be amended, then we will, of course, report back to you that other pathways are again becoming viable. And I'll just leave you with those bullet points which are reflective of the recommendations that are in front of you in the report.
Thank you, Phil and Tian. Huge amount of work again, and exactly what we've been asking for. So, thank you for that. I will go to the Mayor first. He's got a couple of comments and some questions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, the shocking bit about not being able to change Plan Change 78 is just bewildering, really. I'm sure that's an accident of poor legislation rather than plan. Now, my question to you is, when we change, for instance, the zoning along top of a cliff or someplace which is not, we now realise is not a good place to be building, and that thereby devalues the land or whatever is there, are we at risk of some sort of legal claim from the person who says that my block of land is now not worth $1 million, it's now worth a lot less, as a result of that, when in fact you're just zoning something which is pointing out that it was worth less because it was going to slip off anyhow. What is the answer to that, given the weird legal varying landscape that you operate in?
Through the Chair, yes. Under the Resource Management Act, plan changes are able to be more restrictive of development than what the current provisions are. So we need to go through a process of firstly determining that the provisions that we're proposing are what's referred to as appropriate. And so there's a number of statutory tests that are used to be able to arrive at that conclusion. Provided that you actually work within that framework and arrive at appropriate provisions to notify, they are able to proceed to become more restrictive upon development rights. As mentioned in the workshop, there are, however, some safeguards that do sit within the Resource Management Act, so that where that restriction goes beyond a certain point, then there are redress opportunities through the court for compensation to actually be awarded. Now, the thresholds for that are based on the reasonable use of the land being able to continue. What I'm here today to be able to recommend to you through the use of downzoning, as you raise as an example, is not to the extent that it removes the right of that land to be used for a residential use. But it does look at being able to actually limit the intensity of that use to a degree that's actually appropriate given the risks that are faced with that use. So we're not here to recommend that we are looking to change zones of privately owned land from, say, a residential zoning to an open space zoning, or to some sort of zoning which places a moratorium on their ability to be able to continue to occupy or use the land for a residential purpose. But we do believe that there will be some situations where that risk is such that the zoning does need to actually be limited in its intensity.
I mean, I support what you're trying to do. I'm just wanting to canvass that we don't actually open a can of legal claims. And in terms of areas where perhaps this just shouldn't be development at all, I mean, in Carry out there, we just passed whole hillsides and what on earth were people ever allowed to build up there, especially with no sewerage, steep access, fails all over the place. Wasn't the house that failed, the land just slid off, and any geologically trained engineer would have said that's going to happen anyhow. It just struck me as there's a good question, why was it even there? Is it too late to do anything about that? When people's houses slid off, are they to go back and build it there? What are the questions there? How does planning fit in there? Has it got a place, or is it in the building consent? I'm not sure.
Yeah, the Building Act and the Building Code will continue to operate, and there will be those existing use rights that people have to be able to, within a 12-month period, reinstate what's there, provided what's called the character or the intensity and the scale of development doesn't change. But where they do need to actually redevelop in a way which doesn't keep that existing use right, then they will be subject to what the provisions are within the unitary plan on the basis of it being a new build. And so where there are restrictive provisions that sit within the unitary plan that have come in since when that building was created, then they would need to comply with those new, more restrictive provisions. But as mentioned earlier, we're not looking through this work to actually move to zones which take complete rights away of that land being in private ownership and able to be used for private purposes. We do acknowledge, however, that there is the Making Space for Water program, which does have within it the opportunity to be able to work through and acquire sites, which are ones that are at very high risk from natural hazards. And through time, we do plan changes to the unitary plan to be able to look at land which gets vested as reserve and move it from a commercial zoning or a residential zoning to an open space zoning. And what we would need to do is look closely at that land which is acquired through that Making Space for Water program and ensure that it is then given the appropriate zone, given that it's moved from private ownership to public ownership.
Good on you. It sounds tricky, but you seem to have aware of some of the downstream risks of attack, which I'm pleased to hear. Thank you.
Through the chair, if I could just add as well, Phil has described that really well. I think with all of this, and it's like Kataraina said in the previous report, this is about working together holistically across all of these options. And we know, that the government has, set a proposal for voluntary buyouts and other elements like that, which you will need to take a view on, and that's part of that kind of element. The unitary plan sits in a place as well, and so together we need to be clear about what positions we will be taking, and also kind of the right mechanism to use it. So as Phil said, the unitary plan has some uses but some limitations to it, and some of the decisions and thoughts that you've just raised may or may not be best suited to the unitary plan, but we need to holistically consider them all. So we'll want to make sure when we workshop this kind of stuff with you, you can have a kind of holistic conversation, whether or not it's specific to the unitary plan or some other kind of method.
Oh, thanks for that. I mean, it's quite tricky at the moment.
Yeah.
In theory, we're supposed to have sorted out the voluntary buyback provisions by tomorrow, end of business, but I think it might be some months later.
Kia ora. Thank you, Mayor. And just want to say again, the Mayor was very impressed with the work done here. So we just, and hopefully we support that today. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Phil. So just in regards to, I've got two questions, and I promise I won't mention that, what we were talking about in the workshop. But just my first one is, are we looking at where development has actually improved the way in which we deal with stormwater? And so, and we've had presentations here where the staff have said, well, because we've done it this way with our stormwater mitigation, it's actually been far better than what used to exist there. And there are parts of Auckland that have been developed recently under new sort of stormwater management plans that have actually resulted in a far better outcome than used to exist. And that's within brownfield and greenfield areas, because I see this as being a very reactive way of dealing with something based on fear from storm events that we've had. And so I need some comfort that we're actually looking at things in a really proactive way, that there might be parts of Auckland where actually development could be done in a way with certain stormwater mitigations that will actually improve, instead of us saying we're not going to develop there because it's a floodplain or it's traditionally been flood prone or whatever, that we're actually looking at, are we going to be doing that? So the second question actually relates to recommendation B, but
Through the chair. Yes, there are differentials between the outcomes that you can secure if you're working at a bigger scale from the outcomes that you can secure if you're doing it just on a small standard residential site. And so, what we have experienced through good planning, through structure planning, through master plans, through stormwater management planning processes, is that when you've got that community-wide approach, or when you've got the new development area approach, such as the Hobsonville's type examples, then you can secure those outcomes because you're utilising all of that land to be able to address stormwater management. So within the plan change, what we do need to be able to do is actually look at some of those thresholds that we've got for where some of those principles of water-sensitive design are utilised and where they're not. Have we got those thresholds right? And then when we are below those thresholds and it is more of a reliance beyond the site, then what are all of those associated non-regulatory things that are going on, and do they marry with what's going on site, so that the overall result is one where that community become more resilient. So yes, there are differentials between the new development area opportunities and what we have within existing areas, but we need to check on that balance.
cool. So so I just want to see. I'd love to. You'll have to explain that to me when we're at the donkey end of the shop. Sorting this out. My question, Chair, and second question is in regards to Resolution B, and when part of the presentation shows that it's not possible at this stage to determine the specific changes or improvements, but yet in B we actually outline we may use these ones and then the next and then C talks about it coming back to us for guidance. I'm really uncomfortable with us putting into B things that may look or be perceived that we're actually, this is our starting point. I'd prefer to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 removed, and so that, because what we're doing then is we're endorsing the preparation, we're not going into it, we are going into it with an absolute open mind, and we may well do that, but having them in the resolution for me shows that we are already on a path and difficult for us to come back. So if like that, I wouldn't be supporting B. I support the whole rest of it, but I wouldn't be supporting D because I'm uncomfortable with having those things in there, because the perception is we've already started looking and these are the things, the tools we're going to use.
Through the chair, I'm happy to answer if you want to have a if it's a question. The reason that we are suggesting that is not to try and predetermine or push it in any way, but felt it was important. I in particular thought that you would like to see the range of things we'll be looking at. It's not an exclusive list, but both for transparency and for you to understand these are the kinds of things we'll look at and other things. If you don't like them, that's fine. We don't have to include them. I just thought for transparency purposes, it's very clear that it encompasses a range of things, and we still need to work with you about what exactly pops out at the end. So it's not, there was no intention to suggest we were kind of predetermining what's popping out.
And
May include.
Just a response to that, I get that, but we've covered it in this, it's in the report, it's there for all to see. I don't think we need to chuck it out there to say, well, hey, I just don't like it, so.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Walker.
You're asking for questions, but you're also asking for the committee to provide direction. So I'll deal with both together. So the first up question I've got, given that this Section 80E and Section 80G really limits us, as the Mayor has mentioned, and given that this is an outstanding issue, my question is, what is Council going to do about that, particularly in the lead up to the elections, around getting cross-party support as quickly as possible to make the necessary legislative changes? And further to that, how much effort and what is this Council going to do to inform Aucklanders who vote at the elections and have influence with various parties to be informed about this, because it is a huge issue that is relevant right now. We've had major crises in terms of flood events, but we're being stopped in terms of doing anything about it. And I would suggest that there is an imperative for us to apply some effort to that, because the other alternative line that you drew is at odds with something that's more efficient if there is some partnership from the government, and that's a big if. So that's a question that I'm putting to you, Phil, but equally to the Mayor, because he provides leadership for Auckland around this issue.
Thank you, Councillor.
That's my first question.
Yes, so on that, more generally, officials, we are in discussions around this. The Mayor and myself are also looking to write a letter to all parties. At this stage, the focus is with the government, because there is some expectation by government that we're able to do this sort of work within the constraints they've put on us, which is incorrect. So we're trying to make that quite prescript.
Okay.
And there is also policies from other parties which are telling us to do things we cannot do.
Sure. So I understand, but through you, I directed a question to both Phil and the Mayor, not yourself, but I will follow up with another question, which is directed to the Mayor.
You don't need to be rude. I'm the chair, and that was a political question, so I answered in a political way. And Phil can't answer apart from the official side of things. So I will ask Megan, and then the Mayor can reiterate what I've said or say something different. But
sure. Well, I'll just add to my question a little further.
I will get Megan to finish or clarify, and then I can go to your next question.
Sure. It's my question, so I'm more than capable of embellishing it. So when are we going to invite ministers as early as possible to come to Auckland, particularly the Minister of Finance and the Minister for Housing, that were both party to the earlier measure that we've discussed, and other issues, to highlight to them a range of issues that go to our necessity to act on the part of Aucklanders to mitigate these flooding issues and how they can assist us. And on my part, I'm interested in eyeballing those ministers in a meeting, and we should be doing that collectively because this is urgent. So when are we going to do that?
So, Councillor, that I can pass on to Megan and the Mayor, but we are doing that already. We have done that already. There has been a change of ministerial position, so that has been a complicating factor in the last week or so. Our staff, I think on Friday, met through the Recovery Office on these very issues with ministers, including the Deputy Prime Minister. The issues are there. The Mayor is passing on this information.
Do we have a date for the meeting of the councillors and the assembled ministers? Have we organised that? If so, when is the date?
There is no...
You're saying that we are doing it, so I'm interested in knowing what the date is. Thanks.
You're looking for a degree of accuracy which doesn't exist. The only dates that I've been given so far are that by Friday everything's going to be sorted for the voluntary buyback, which is completely irresponsible and won't happen at all. In terms of inviting ministers to come up here, there's a standard invitation for those sorts of things, but ministers live in Wellington and are concerned about something or other that's going to happen in October. And I'm doing my best to get through. So we are utilising modern things like telephones and emails to get across our views on particularly things that emerge quickly, like what happened yesterday with the sudden emergence of the Oranga-Tamariki power grab. Kaori, I'm sorry, not Oranga-Tamariki. I get the mixed OT-KO, blooming hectares. My apologies there. I think my office and the Chief Executive's office are in constant touch with the relative people down the line, informing them of where we are and things. With regard to the Category 3, there is a lot of complexity which hasn't been considered by the officials. And whilst we don't want to slow things down, we don't want to walk into areas which are not clearly thought out about the long-term impacts on, there's way more categories than just one simple thing. We're going to pass a thing and say you're going to spend this amount of that. It's so that we're being not difficult but careful. And with the result of this morning's thing, I haven't actually written that letter yet, but I've got people up there thinking about what we're going to go put in it, and it will be emailed promptly, followed by telephone calls. I mean, the first thing I knew about the KO, not OT, my mistake, was this morning when the chairperson rang me in a sheepish way. So I think we are responding quickly and promptly and resolutely and carefully, especially carefully.
The other questions stroke comments I've got, just as it goes to the plan change, Phil, in instances where councillors are aware of anomalies, things that need sorting out. For example, out at West Park, Hobbsville Marina, there's a zoning allowing residential development on the edge of the marina that's against the provisions of the Coastal Policy Statement, against the provisions of the Empowering Act. It's obviously a site that's subject to coastal inundation. Will this plan change conceivably give us the scope to tidy things like that up? Because we'll be doing it anyway.
For coastal inundation, we look at habitable or non-habitable use in terms of the way in which we manage things. And the way that precincts work is that they tweak or amend what those provisions are that apply across all of Auckland. So if we are to look at amendments to those coastal inundation controls that are within E36, we will of course then need to look at all of those precincts that hinge off or rely upon those very same provisions. So these are things that we will need to workshop to be able to work our way down through the plan. And one of the key starting points will be that E36 chapter to see how it can be improved, and then we can step through further from there.
The other question I've got just goes to down zoning and a variation of it. If there's some form of construction, and for example, the early wooden house pile construction of homes enables homes to be raised and for water to flow underneath. In that respect, the heritage homes of Auckland have significant advantages. Is it conceivable that this plan change process enables types of development, which other cities have, whereby you've got development that accommodates a measure of flooding and the like, so we don't have to, obliterate a zoning, we arrive at a more nuanced approach.
So there are a few things that we'll need to be cognizant of. So we do need to be looking at the long term, the life expectancy of buildings, and certainly for coastal situations through the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement, we're looking at a 100-year time horizon. The other thing to actually think about will be the actual risk tolerances that are acceptable risk tolerances, which will also be a very relevant matter through the Making Space for Water program as well. And the reason I raise that is that we in the unitary plan manage life, property, infrastructure and the environment. And so we need to consider that risk tolerance against those four things to arrive at a conclusion that the provisions need to be amended and strengthened. Now, it could be that there are solutions which can be taken at the site level to alleviate some of those risks. So we would need to actually look at, for instance, the pile foundation opportunities and the ability to raise buildings that are on piles, to consider against firstly that risk tolerance and then that property and life in particular matter.
Sure.
For whether those solutions are the best ones to support within the unitary plan. So again, it's quite a stepped process to go through of workshopping. In this situation, we'd start with the risk tolerance conversation first.
And the last question I've got, Mr. Chair, is are we going to adopt a far more dynamic approach to inundation, given that the unitary plan in terms of sea level rise projections is already out of date because sea level rise is accelerating, and we're on the start of an accelerative curve that is certainly non-linear. It's a curve, and it's worst case scenario because sea level rise is locked in to the tune of tens of metres.
There was a slide that was put up that looked at what can be done within the existing regime that we've got. And one of the bullet points that was on that slide spoke about dynamic adaptive pathways, which is the point that you raise, around being able to approve and condition development in a way which enables for it to be managed through time in a better way. There may well be opportunities within plans themselves to be able to actually have that same approach of where there are provisions that become active provisions based on certain events occurring. So it is certainly an area of investigation that we'd like to explore with you through workshops.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thank you. Just so I can understand your response to Councillor Baker and his question. So, in my naivety, the zoning is restrictive on the public so that we reduce or we help mitigate the effects. Is it prescriptive? Is a zoning set in place prescriptive on council to do things like all pipes in this zoning area have to be a minimum of 1 metre OD and all that sort of stuff? Is there a prescriptive content that council has to come up with in these zonings?
It could be that within zones, those types of controls are appropriate. What you do need to consider is is that the right legislation to use to manage that type of activity? Or are things like Telecommunications Acts, Gasworks Acts, those sort of things, the more appropriate legislation to manage those things? What I would say is that that E36 Auckland-wide chapter applies not just to the private property, it also applies to the way in which we are resilient with our own roading and other infrastructure, and the way in which we actually undertake that, particularly in these locations of risk. So, yes, there is a looking in the mirror aspect of this as well.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have so many questions. This is such a maze. And Phil, you have explained it with as much clarity as you possibly can. I think I will reserve some of the things that I'd like to explore till the next workshop. I wonder, as part of that workshop, whether it would be possible just to test our ideas and things against bringing some folk in. I was thinking particularly of Des Morrison, former councillor, and he was on the AHP. He'd be a really good person to bring in and just use as a sounding board for some of our thinking as a neutral party. I don't know whether you've thought about those who could, we're getting great guidance from staff and they're doing fantastic work in this terribly complex area, but just to make, not that the two are quite different, but with the long-term plan, I really enjoyed the workshopping we were doing yesterday, and I would feel that if we could try and introduce some of that sort of thinking into how we grapple with this, because there's lots and lots and lots of questions that I have, and I'm probably better to come and informally speak to you, but I would like our workshops to have the opportunity of having some sounding boards for different ideas that we might have.
So recommendation D, which relates to the engagement plan, to be worked through with the Recovery Office and then brought back to the Chair and Deputy Chair and IMSB member, is perhaps one vehicle to be able to bring in those other voices. But certainly within the workshop environment, it's another opportunity as well. Yes, I've had a working relationship with Des Morrison for some time, and through his previous roles at Glenbrook Steel Mill in health and safety, he probably has a very good perspective on risk, which could add value. Yes, more than happy to reach out to Des Morrison and check whether he's willing to be involved.
I'm sure he will be. I've had a few calls from him, but I would really value that. Thank you. And again, thank you for taking us through very clearly, well, as clearly as you can in what is pretty murky territory, to understand what our options are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Ferry.
Thanks. My question's very specific, and it's actually about Resolution D, so the engagement plan work. I just wanted to ask a little bit about what the intended scope and timeframes are for that. Obviously, yet to come up with the plan, but I guess I would just I'm seeking some reassurance that we're looking here at potentially a few different levels of communication that one of the things that I'm finding with the flooding is a lot of our communication is specifically to, for example, the owners of homes with stickers. But actually there are a lot of other people in our community who are really interested in what's happening and who have a stake. So wanting, I guess, some reassurance that we're looking at some engagement that's going to work at a few different levels in terms of stakeholders who might be interested at a regional or neighbourhood level, but also individual property level. Thanks.
Probably a couple of comments on that. So, yeah, certainly for an engagement plan, the audiences can be broken probably into 2 or 3 broad audiences. So there'll be those that are most impacted, which is probably the ones with respect to zoning implications. There'll be the broader stakeholders that have an interest in natural hazards and the communities beyond those sites and the impacts upon them. Mana Whenua and Mata Waka will have particular interest in this issue. And then, of course, there does need to be the actual communication aspect of the engagement plan as well. It is fair to say it's early days. We do need to actually get an endorsement to be able to proceed with this work and to start to get a feel for the appropriateness of the actual response that the plan change has got. And by that I mean that significance and scale of change, because that actually has a direct bearing on the scale of the engagement that you do, the resourcing that's needed for it, the time scale over which you do it, the extent of iterations that there might be to it. Maybe through the workshop process we can commit to updating you on the progression of the engagement side of things.
Great, thank you. That's really good to hear that that level of thinking is being brought to it already. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Ferry. Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thanks. This is on the public agenda, of course, and I've just been fielding a few questions from people in my community, just asking for a little bit more information at this stage as to what B5 means in practical terms for obviously parts of the Auckland region. That's to intensify development of well-connected, lower-risk areas. Now, this may have been brought up at the workshop, but given that we are in public, I think it would be useful just to clarify exactly what might be getting anticipated there. And I say that because if we're looking at the flood events, I can think of any number of areas that fared pretty well. You've got your new subdivision, but you've also got existing subdivisions or communities that have, in pretty short space of time, gone from, in the Auckland Unitary Plan, from, say, single site to mixed housing urban. Then we had the kind of MP, SUD and the medium density provisions. They're essentially all upzoned to mixed housing urban. We do that against the backdrop of knowing that there's already, 900,000 sites here available. So, Phil, in practical terms, what do people in the various parts of Auckland, I guess, in the medium density, are they looking at being upzoned again, or is it, just a few locations? I guess, people will have some concern, given that level of intensification that's already happened in a very short space of time. They're in a floodless zone. Have they got anything to worry about in terms of another quantum increase in intensification?
Through the chair, and we did traverse this at the workshop. The key word in that particular recommendation is the term well connected. So the context of that is where in that well connected location there are significant natural hazard risks, and the need is to be able to change the zoning to be more reflective of that risk. In other words, to do some downzoning. Then we're looking at whether or not that location still benefits from its great connections that it's got. And the example that we gave on screen was a centre, where the centre was on its edge significantly impacted by a flooding area, which could, through a plan change, be the subject of downzoning. Then it could well be appropriate that other areas around that centre respond to that downzoning by enabling opportunity, so that the overall benefits that that centre's got because of the transport network, etc., are still realised.
So people don't have a concern that it's carte blanche for opening up other areas then.
Yeah, this particular recommendation should not be read in isolation.
Okay, thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor. Deputy Mayor Simpson.
Thank you, Chair. Look, I just wanted to ask a question. I think this is very, very important work. I wanted to ask a question to help Councillor Baker by way of a clarification. So basically what you're saying, you've given 5 examples, but the keywords here, which may include, but the grammar is very bad actually, but it says which may include but not be limited to. I think that also answers Councillor Watson's question, because these are just examples that you're going to look at before you bring them, you know, as part of a wider package that you will bring back for us to make a final call on. So I don't think we need to be frightened of the 5, because there might be 7 or 9, there could be 2. But it's publicly giving some sorts of examples of the sorts of things we are looking at before any final decision making is made. Is that correct? Because I think a lot of people are thinking this is a done deal. These are the things you're absolutely just going, the only things you're going to do, and that's not correct. So I just wanted to help my colleagues, because I think B is actually important, just to give a bit of a public flavour of the sorts of things that may or may not be included. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely correct. And to give another example, which I spoke about earlier, was the way in which we define the locations around the coastline that are at risk. Now, of course, we do that through a text definition. It's in the unitary plan at the moment. And the option that we're going to look at is moving to a mapped-based definition of that. So we could add number 6 to that list if we wished and identify definitions. And it is a non-exhaustive list. It is simply an indicator of some of the things that we'll bring back to you as options.
And I suppose my second question is more political to you, Chair, and that is the risk of not putting any examples creates doubt, for want of a better word, of the things that we may do that people think is completely wrong, you know. So, I mean, it's a start of 10, 5, without confirming the 5, correct?
Exactly, Deputy Mayor. The issue is, and what was brought forward at the workshop, we have to give direction to staff. This will be an expensive, a long, a complicated process with lots of consultation. The city, the way I hear it, wants to go very fast on, you know, stopping development, protecting floodplains, all sorts of things. That is not going to be possible to go at the pace maybe that we expect, but we do have to give some direction. Otherwise, staff could go away for a long time and do a whole lot of things, come to us, and we will go, no, that's not what we asked for. This gives us some specific areas where the team can work on, bring back to us, because we will, once again, like everything in this place, there will have to be compromise, there will have to be legal things that we have to do, and people will then consult and we'll have to change it all again, or, you know, so.
Okay, well, I won't need to speak again, but I do support where this is going, noting that there's a lot of work between now and where we finally end up by way of a decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. Councillor Lee.
Yes, thank you very much. Clearly, something needs to be done in regard to planning and consents. As the Trade Journal One Roof reported last year, Auckland Council gave resource consents for a building in 2,200 sites in floodplains, flood zones, and hazardous areas, and that's about 9% of all consents, according to One Roof. So clearly something has to be done. But what I'm concerned about is that Healthy Waters has a very sensible, visionary scheme to simply move in and acquire properties that are in hazardous zones or hazard zones, and especially flood zones. And can I get an assurance that this bureaucratic planning exercise will not interfere with that? It will support it?
Through the Chair, yes. The officer-to-officer discussions that are occurring in CPO and within Healthy Waters are almost a daily basis. And so also with the Recovery Office, there's an innate understanding of where that work's going. I do see that through the workshops we'll potentially need to continue to bring those sort of expertise to the table to be able to talk about the non-regulatory work that proceeds alongside the unitary plan work. And you're absolutely right with respect to the making space for water specifically and the acquisition of sites, that is a very important matter associated with the plan change, because if you step back and think about those locations, and those locations being the ones that are at most risk, then there are solutions which come from that making space for water project associated with those sites. But the unitary plan needs to continue to play a role as well, given that program will be going for 6 years, and in the meantime, development rights can continue.
As long as the two processes don't get crossed, if you like, and one holds up the other, you know, who would know what the squadrons of lawyers and planners unleashed by Kāinga Ora and New Zealand Property Council might do on principle? I don't know. But it's just something that we need to be clear about, that Healthy Waters should be allowed to move ahead with their acquisitions without, you know, legal planning problems holding them up. And certainly the council needs to resolve those planning issues. I take it you're okay with budget. When the community raised the need for plan changes for helipads, there was quite a lot of knotted brows about the need for budget and whether we could afford it. And so I'm confident you'll be okay in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. And yes, absolutely, we are very connected. The Making Space for Water and this body of work and the regulatory responses all coming together. And you will find that there will be cases where they all overlap, but I can assure you they're not trying to stop the good work. It may be about putting a planning framework on top of great projects that we're doing. Kia ora. Thank you. Councillor Darby.
Thank you. Phil, I think this is not so much for your area, but Megan, maybe for you, because I don't think this can be addressed under the B. But I'm aware that the Auckland Design Manual, which is not a statutory requirement for anybody, but it does give guidance. It does have a coastal environment section, which is actually pretty light. I've actually looked at it, and it looks like somebody started it but didn't finish it. Maybe this is the opportunity to develop that section, and also the stormwater and hazards section. There's some good work there, but maybe that's something that could be looked at. So in this overall process, Megan, has anybody brought to your attention the need to focus on those non-statutory tools that actually guide people? They show people how, you know, you could possibly do it rather than the way that they were planning to do it in the coastal environment and stormwater sensitive areas? Comment?
Yeah, through the chair, thank you. So while this report is obviously focused on the unitary plan, which is a regulatory document, there are non-regulatory methods, and the Auckland Design Manual is one of those, or, you know, assisting people to understand how to build and with different materials and, you know, all of those kinds of things. So we are looking at the non-regulatory methods, and yes, the Auckland Design Manual, you know, we have struggled to prioritise that work and with budget and things, but it is part of the work that we're looking at about non-regulatory. So I think that's going to kind of keep coming through to you in the future. So I'm happy to keep that at the forefront and make sure that we respond to that.
Thank you, Councillor. Very good point. And that will be some of the things we can do a lot quicker too. Right, we have probably exhausted the staff and ourselves, but we've exhausted the questions. Thanks, team, for that. We'll get you to step away from the desk. What is it, table? Really appreciate the work. So first off, in speaking order, we've got Deputy Chair, Councillor Dalton.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to thank Phil and Sharon while they were there, now walking away from the table. It's such a big piece of work, and just going through our briefings and the questions that you ask. I mean, you've led this work, you've pushed on it. Thank you for that. It's, you know, consistently with this and the FDS and everything else that's going on. It's such a big bit of work, and I think to perhaps keep us safe from political lobbying, because not everything's going to make everybody happy, is that our focus needs to continue to remain on keeping people safe, keeping houses safe. I mean, if we keep our eye on that ball, then it's easier when we get lobbied by people who are not happy with downzoning in particular, because, you know, it is a cost for them. Just the work that our staff does, your team, Megan, and at the moment with so much to do, and just to be able to really flip and be able to focus on this is incredible. And I was listening to Phil answer questions, and I thought, particularly to Councillor Walker, because he asked some pretty gnarly questions, to use a Councillor Henderson term. But the responses are just so good for the learning for all of us, I think. So that continues to give me confidence in all of the work that's been done here by our team. I don't have a problem with B5 B1, 2, 3, 4, 5 so much. It does say it's not limited to that, but I agree with Councillor Simpson. It's important to list some things, otherwise people might be left guessing, have we thought about that? So, you know, there's a taster there. But I'll be supporting this, and just, again, thanks to everyone for all of the hard work that's going on here. It is so complex, and this is only one little piece of the whole pie that we're trying to work on now. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Deputy Chair Dalton. Councillor Walker.
I'll just make one comment, and that's my concern around 5, and that goes to intensive development of well-connected lower-risk areas. Well-connected is just part of the issue there. There might be an area that might be well-connected, but it could be part of a larger catchment on a hilly area that's feeding into the part of the catchment below that floods and just makes it worse, irrespective of whether there are houses there or not. So I think that this notion that we're party to this capture on the part of the government, that we have to fit so many people in, is something that we need to attack directly with all parties, and we should be running a major campaign around that. And picking up on comments that Councillor Fletcher has made in the past, we do need to look at limits to growth for Auckland. It may not be a location that's suited to mega millions of people because of all sorts of constraints.
Thank you, Councillor. Mayor Brown.
Yeah, I think this is good work, and I'd like to thank the planner for that. I'm not usually very all that kind to planners, but you're doing well. I think in terms of 5 there, this is an option to intensify development in those areas. It's not compulsory, and the market will determine whether it just allows for some people who think there's an option there to take advantage of it. So, and I think it balances the other areas with downsizing. We're not going to be doing that. So, and it clearly highlights it may include but not limited to. In fact, if you wanted to, you could put a 6 in there saying, and any other clever ideas that pop up would be okay with me as well. So I'm quite happy to push this along. I think it's good work. It's got to be done. And it's in keeping with my stance that Aucklanders have to decide what we're doing in Auckland. And so if we don't carry on with this work, some other drongo down the line will tell us what to do. So I'm happy to support this.
Thank you, Mayor Brown. Very good points. Is there any other speakers before I finish up? No. Right, thank you. Yeah, once again, just want to acknowledge the staff, especially on this, taking the I guess, action from Councillor Dalton and I, the Mayor and Deputy Mayor and others in those, 2 weeks after the flooding. Everyone has really battened down the hatches and got some significant work done. I do agree with Councillor Walker and others around the issues we have re-government not understanding exactly how we are boxed in on Plan Change 78, and it's difficult to act faster, but as the Mayor says, we have to take leadership on our own and continue this work and progress this work on whatever timeline we are having to. So if we can pull it forward, if there are ways that we can negotiate and change, that's great. If we can't, we still have to ensure this work is being pushed and fitting into the boxes that we are forced into, which is exactly some of the issues we find ourselves in when it comes to flooding and planning, and the fact we cannot and probably will not through this process be able to prohibit development anywhere. People assume that we shouldn't be consenting in valleys and on cliffs and things like that, but largely the legislative frameworks we work in and our teams have to work in has to allow development. It's up to us to figure out how we can, as Councillor Dalton says, protect people, protect property, and start to look at what our city looks like as we adapt for climate change. Does not mean we should give up the goals of mitigating and reducing our emissions and getting action on climate change and working with other cities around the world, but it does mean we have to look at our planning framework, continually update it, and show our community that we are listening and seeing with our eyes what is happening out there, when we have these catastrophic events, but also what is happening day to day, whether it's too hot, too wet, and everything else that comes with climate change. So I think this is great work. We will bring back as much as we can that we can change without plan changes. We will bring back as many options and tools. I know that Healthy Waters and others are looking at a toolbox of things that businesses and individuals and households can do that will help protect their homes if we can't change things through a big infrastructure project. And then there'll be other ways that long term we have changed the planning documents to make sure that communities have certainty of where they can build, what's expected up the road, but also protects future generations from maybe what we haven't locked in previous decades. So I think this is a great bit of work. I want to acknowledge everyone around the table. I know it's difficult and complex, but it pushes us to the next stage, and we hope we can speed some of that work forward. So thank you very much. All those in favour?
Aye.
Are there anyone opposed? Kia ora, thank you very much. Right, we do need to move an extension